Hello, and I would like to welcome you to this installment of the Russia Question. I'm the director of the Russian program at Fordham University and host of the webinar. My name is Michael Ossorgin. The Russia Question is one of the many initiatives of the Orthodox Christian Studies Center at Fordham University. The Fordham Center facilitates, funds, and publishes scholarship on the Orthodox Christian world, broadly understood. To learn more about the center, its initiatives, or publications, please visit the website at www.fordham.edu/orthodoxy. We would also encourage you to follow us on YouTube and to share this and other videos with anyone who might benefit from it. Today, we invite to the Russia Question Dr. Hanna Stähle, who holds a PhD in Slavic Cultural Studies, summa cum laude, from the University of Passau. During her PhD studies, she was research fellow at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow and gathered professional experience at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, the Carnegie Center Moscow. She is the author of the book that we'll discuss today, Mediatization of Orthodoxy, Russian Church in the Digital Era, and numerous articles on the contemporary Russian Orthodox Church and media. She is currently senior manager at Philea, Philanthropy Europe Association. She also serves as a board chair of the German-Belarusian Society. Hanna Stähle speaks 8 languages and lives with her husband in Brussels. Welcome, Hanna.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Well, thank you for writing such a wonderful book. I had so much to learn from it, and we have so much to discuss. First off, I wanted to give you a chance to just sort of situate it for us, how it came about, and anything else you would like for us to know from the beginning, please.
Thank you, Michael. And again, thank you so much for hosting this session. I've listened to some other sessions that you have organized previously, and it's really fantastic scholars focusing on Russian Orthodoxy.
I agree.
And Alexandra Gachanyan and Paul Valliere, whom you will invite for one of the future sessions, whom I admire a lot. So yes, let me talk about the book, which is here, The Russian Church in the Digital Era, Mediatization of Orthodoxy. This book essentially deals with the changed role of Russian Orthodoxy, of the Russian Orthodox Church in contemporary Russia, in particular in the context of modern media. And I found it always quite fascinating that Russian Orthodoxy is never just about religion. It's also about politics. It's also about national identity. It's about culture. It's about values, and it's about Russian society at large. So it's a very, very broad question that you have to investigate. This book is describing a quite paradox religious situation in Russia today, and the changing role of the Russian Orthodox Church. So we have very high levels of religious affiliation, association with the Russian Orthodox Church on the one hand. On the other hand, we have quite a low level of actual participation in this life. So the majority of the Russian population until today has positive attitudes towards the church, but at the same time remains unchurched. So the impact of the church on everyday lives of Russian citizens, of the Russian population, is negligible. Another aspect which is very important is, of course, the political aspect of this transformation. Because since Vladimir Putin's return to power, to presidency in 2012, the state has advanced a conservative values agenda and has facilitated the image of the church as a purveyor of cultural traditions, of values, and one of the key pillars and supporters of the Kremlin's pivots to authoritarianism, to conservatism. So the Russian state has refashioned itself from a sovereign democracy, a concept that was popular in the 2000s, into a supposedly God-given autocratic state, which is advocating for the true Christian nation and is supported by the Russian Church. And the personality of Patriarch Kirill is also quite particular and quite important because he has become the head of the Russian Orthodox Church in 2009, and he has entered the church as a reformer. He had a huge modernization agenda in front of him, and he has become quite vocal in criticizing globalization, in criticizing individualism, secularism, and describing this as values alien to the Russian culture. And in that, really supporting also this authoritarian turn of the Russian state and providing the ideological armory to the Russian state. But what is also interesting when you analyze the Russian church in Russia today is the media context. And to be honest, it took me months and years to arrive at a point to realize that actually I had to take media lenses to better describe and to better understand this anomalous religious situation of unchurched Orthodox majority and how the church is interacting with these people who associate themselves with Christianity, but actually stay far away from religious rites, religious services. So the media is a sphere that has become absolutely important for the church in order to reach this unchurched, practicing Orthodox majority. So in terms of the context and contents and the structure of the book, I start by providing a very general overview of the latest developments of the religious transition in Russia, looking really precisely into the question, how is it possible that there are such high levels of association with Orthodoxy after 7 decades of atheism? Why did it come this way? Then, of course, the reforms, the changes under Patriarch Kirill, because he had a huge impact on the church and how it is functioning today. And it's quite interesting. And there are not so many not so many English language sources speaking about this. Then I go into the analysis of the media strategy of the Russian Orthodox Church. So basically looking into specifically into how the church has addressed this issue and has developed a policy towards the media sphere and how to address also younger generations. And then I provide a classification of different circles in Russian society and how they deal with the church, secular circles, atheist circles, and religious circles, of course, as well. And this is followed by the analysis of several case studies, 3 case studies that deal with the question of religion and media, conflictual situation, which help us really understand and see these dividing lines in Russian society, such as the Pussy Riot case or the YouTube case or the clerical project website ahila.ru.
Excellent. That's a great starting place for our discussion. And since you finished on Pussy Riot, it seems like a good way into our conversation, particularly because, as you point out, what happened was essentially a media event, right? I mean, the bulk of what happened took place online, right? The event itself, it's well known, is just a very short amount of time, and very few people saw it. But once it was recorded and put online, then it had an effect on the media space or the media public. Would you say a little bit more about that and why you chose to write about it?
Thank you for that question. And indeed, I'm sure there are a lot of people in the audience today asking the question, why Pussy Riot? Why again this case? There has been so much written about this, different journals and book chapters and entire books dedicated to the case. But to me, it was absolutely clear that I can't really leave it aside, because this has been such a conflict in Russian society. And the perception of the case in the West and in Russia has been quite different. And the media aspect is of particular importance to understand the case and to understand the importance of Pussy Riot's performance. Because usually when you read articles about the punk prayer, then they begin by describing the performance. And it seems that it's been really an orchestrated performance, well prepared, and staged in Christ the Savior Cathedral in Moscow. But this is actually not what happened, I assume that none of us in this seminar, in this session today, have actually attended the service at the time. And there have been just a few witnesses, a few guards who had a chance to see this. So the reference that we have is actually not the performance itself in the church, but the videotyped version, a clip of this performance. And it's quite important because there is another video clip of the punk prayer and how it happened in the church. And there it's actually quite difficult to even understand what is being said. You hardly hear any words from the song, so you hardly can understand what it means. And here you see that because this video clip has been put together, and parts of it have been introduced from other performances that the band had before, just a few days before the Punk Prayer in Christ the Savior Cathedral. They have recorded some parts in Yelochovo Cathedral in Moscow and put it together. And actually after the performance, they have written that, well, it's been an utter failure, this performance. So they didn't succeed and didn't achieve what they wanted to achieve, because most of the members were hindered when they were performing. So here you see that what actually happened was this failure, at least the perception in the first days. But then the performance itself had a huge impact, as we know, on the Russian society, on Russian politics. It has led to the criminalization of religious feelings. So it had a huge impact. But it was this video clip in particular, this was the mediatized performance, if you wish, because the video clip consisted of the performance parts that were shot in the Christ the Savior Cathedral. The music was added, the songs were added, and this particular video clip, so this mediatized video had an impact on the viewers, and in a way has become the reality, has substituted the reality. Because I'm sure that if we had a look at the non-edited video, then it would not have any influence and would have probably be forgotten very, very soon. And you're mute, Michael.
Classic. Well, so it brought attention to a certain segment of the population that's more media savvy too, right? And what's interesting, you point out in your book, is that these were not necessarily churched Russians, right? Who were kind of learning about the church, some of them, through this event, right? And the event itself can be formative for that reason, because there's not kind of let's say, an existing culture in many of the non-church going Russian Orthodox parishioners to resist against whatever it is that they see online, right? So it ends up having an outsized effect. But the event itself, like you say, and you point out, is sort of a Rorschach test, right? Where everybody looks into what happened and sees something different, completely different, based on their own hang-ups, let's say, right, or values. And I suppose that means that, you know, there are former believers who are skeptical of the church, who still felt like they deserved mercy, right, that they were being too harshly treated for something relatively minor. And then you have the other end of the spectrum. So that ends up being also another way of sort of opening us up to the kinds of critics that exist of Kirill's and Putin's church. Who are those prominent critics? I mean, could you tell us about them?
Yes, it's a good question, but maybe before coming to that, what is interesting about the Pussy Riot case is that in the Russian society, the response was very negative on all sides. So it was not just about Orthodox fundamentalists or the churched Orthodox community. It was really about the Russian society at large. So if you look at the online debates, if you look at the statistics also provided, so a very tiny population, it's about 1% considered this art and has seen this as a kind of a political protest. So that's quite different from the discourse in the West that has seen this including political terms and also in religious terms. And also what is interesting is that this discourse has shifted down over time. So at the beginning, most people, including Alexei Navalny at the time, including really a lot of Russian liberals, who said that, well, it's just bad taste, that I cannot really support this. So the discourse can be described as, I cannot but condemn. So for different reasons, for some for political reasons, for many, of course, for religious reasons as well. But then when the church, and it started with the deceased Всеволод Chaplin, when the church started demanding prosecution of the punk band, the discourse started to shift. And in particular, among those who are churched, among the Orthodox community, who could not understand this stance, this position, and wanted to show mercy also to these young women. And the discourse shifted towards, I condemn, yes, but, and you could see a lot of arguments put together. But then if you look indeed at the circles within Russian society, then you see different voices, and it's important to differentiate between them when we analyze critical responses and attitudes towards the contemporary Orthodox Church. So there is quite a big faction within the church itself. It's religious critics who know the church life quite well, who understand religious rights, who participate in the communion, and who are able to comment not only on church-state relations or church and society relations, but also on internal church issues. And among them, there are different groups. So here you have to differentiate within the Russian Orthodox Church between conservatives, between liberals, between fundamentalists, because they have really different arguments they put together in different positions from which they argue, and it's important to differentiate between these groups. So on the one hand, you have religious critics, that you have atheist critics, of course, as well, that address the church. It's not a majority of the population. It's quite a small faction in Russian society, but it's quite vocal, in particular in the media sphere. So that's why it's very important. And the church is usually addressing these critics and is describing them as people who use a campaign against the church and attacks on the church. But the largest group of Russian society is actually secular critics. So these are people who have often an unpronounced relationship towards the Russian Orthodox Church. So they do not argue from the position of either a religious or non-religious person. And usually they focus not on religious issues per se, but on political issues, on societal issues. And here the obvious politicization of Russian Orthodoxy is quite prominent. So that's a topic that is very visible in this debate.
Great. And Patriarch Kirill seems to have a handle on just how to manage the media end of things, right? Or at least he's particularly interested in that. How does he approach the mediatization of Orthodoxy?
I'm not sure he would agree that there is mediatization of Orthodoxy.
Sure. Yeah.
I would have to discuss it with him, and also my claim that the Russian Orthodox Church has a media strategy. Of course, there is no such document that is called the media strategy of the Russian Orthodox Church. Mm-hmm. But I do believe that it's very important, and the personality of Patriarch Kirill is very specific here. And I think that it's connected to the fact that he embraced the media sphere quite early in his career. He has a very popular program on the first Russian channel, Первый канал, which is called Slovo Pastыря, the word of a pastor. And Kirill is someone who is, he's a gifted preacher. He has a wonderful command of the Russian language. So it's really a pleasure to listen to him. He's using complex structures. He's using beautiful words. He's using beautiful metaphors. But at the same time, he speaks in a way that people can approach him and can really understand him. And what is interesting, because of this program, I believe, because he kind of learned to speak in front of audiences, but of course also because of his rank, and because of him speaking and addressing the flock, so he's very much used to speaking really from his heart, openly. There is even an episode I read where he shared that at one point he had to address the flock, and he had some statements, some statements written for himself that he has prepared. And then he was there and just understood it's not what he needed to say to the people. It's not what they wanted to hear from him. So he just dropped this and started speaking really from his heart. And that is how he started really using message in addressing people. So he has become really a master of that. And if you follow this program, Word of a Pastor, then you realize that he's really addressing not only religious issues. Of course, he's speaking about Orthodox traditions, saints, etc. But he's also providing commentary on more contemporary issues. He's speaking about political issues. He's speaking about social issues. So he kind of elevated the church into a level of a public actor, of someone who has a position on modern issues. And what is also interesting about him is that when he became patriarch in 2009, he immediately started thinking and started changing policy towards media. So if you look at the changes that he introduced, then you just realize that literally within days since his enthronement, he started suggesting ideas like establishing the synodal information department, introducing methodological guidelines, introducing staff positions. So really basically restructuring the church. And also if you read his addresses at conciliar meetings, then you're just astonished by the importance that he gives to the media sphere. So he's just constantly referring to the media. And he's kind of preaching to bishops, and to the Orthodox community, like, you have to be serious about the media sphere, because that's where the flock is, and we have to use and we have to embrace modern media. And he's very, if you analyze his language, you see that he's quite knowledgeable about the field. So he's using words like information campaigns and attacks, but also high quotations that are required. So he's really the one who is behind adapting the church's stance towards the media sphere. So even though there are a lot of critical voices within the church towards the media sphere, towards in particular social networks, and a lot of anxiety, Mikhail Suslov is writing about this, for instance, in particular among fundamentalist circles. But despite this, he is recognizing the importance and has made considerable changes also.
Good, and he has to be knowledgeable, I suppose, about this in part because, as you point out in your book, the internet presents a special kind of challenge to dogma, right? Or to the control of information, or to the control of interpretation. So it seems like that's in a way where his information war, if you can call it that, or his information challenges, I suppose, are fought, right? Can you tell us a little bit about how the different types of media online are contributing to a kind of, I don't know, general, let's say, smashing of unified or dogmatic beliefs?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that this is really a challenge to the church, but to any religious organization, because in particular, or political institution, indeed. So it's just a fragmented sphere, right? And people have different interests. They have different areas where they engage. So you can't, or you hardly can actually control this. And for the church, it's quite challenging, in particular in the Russian context. And we know that the media sphere is regulated, it's not free. So to control the broadcast media, to control religious media is quite easy. And this is what is happening in Russia. So most of the broadcast media are either controlled by the state or the editorial policy is aligned with the state. The same can be said about the religious media. So here, the authority is quite clear. And here we come back to Peter Kirill's program, What of a Pastor? So he's the one who's kind of preaching to the audience, he's addressing the audience, but he's not necessarily expecting dialogue. He's not necessarily the one who needs to engage in a controversial discussion, but he is the one who has the authority. He knows what to say, how to say this, and he's just giving you this information. And online, this is completely different. So this is a completely different situation, and you have a variety of voices, religious, non-religious, secular voices. And we've seen in Russia that the internet has massively spread in the 2010s. It was not the case in the early 2000s. It was much slower in Russia than in the West and in Western countries. But then in the 2010s, a number of blogs, a number of social networks emerged. And people started, of course, also debating and discussing religious issues. And here you see quite a discrepancy, which I find very fascinating and interesting. So this triumphalist, very positive image of Orthodoxy in broadcast media, kind of the image of Orthodoxy, the popular vernacular Orthodoxy, or the role of the church as the nation builder, as the promoter of traditional values, which is unchallenged, in most cases really unchallenged. And then online you have quite a different stance. So you have debates about a lot of political issues, of course. There is a lot of criticism about the politicization of the church, that the state is using the church for its ideological ends. A lot is focusing also on the commercialization of the church, on the luxury that people observe. And it's not always the representation of reality as it is. And that is why the media theory is so important here, and the mediatization theory. It's kind of, in a way, a distorted reality. It is informed by the reality. It is informed by what's happening on the federal TV. But at the same time, it has a lot of trends towards scandalization, towards contestation of religion. So the interest of secular critics in particular is mostly fascinated by the tensions in the society. And the church and its media policy, I think what is problematic and what is kind of driving this politicization, also contestation of religion, is that there is not so much independent reporting about the church. And when there is no independent information about the church, then any news, anything can really become a scandal. And that is what is happening in Russia on a daily basis.
Fascinating, yes. I certainly have a lot more questions. I want to open it up to our audience, and we have one question from Aristotle Papanikolaou, who asks, is the public's positive view of church changing? Is there a backlash against the Russian Orthodox Church's more public role? That's something you address, yes?
Yes, definitely. So we can frame it also in more positive terms. The fact that there is a backlash and the fact that there is criticism of the church is also very much indicative of this heightened visibility of the church, of its increased importance. So you really have to acknowledge that the church has become so relevant, that the church has become so important, so visible in the public domain, and also in politics, that it basically cannot be ignored. And that is why it is also accompanied by so much interest and so many debates and contested discussions. So the public visibility is a very important concept. And for me, this journey of better understanding this, it has started actually with a book by Jose Casanova, who was one of the first ones to really explain this controversy between the secularization thesis on the one hand, which has dominated the discourse and the sociology of religion for many, many decades. And then on the other hand, still this presence of religion in the public sphere and the interest of societies in religious matters. And with the help of this book, I really began to understand and to see, of course, you can have a differentiation of society and you can have a modernization of society, but it does not necessarily mean that religion diminishes or loses its relevance, but it's changing dramatically. And that is what is so fascinating about the church in Russia today. It's very modern. Unlike its claims.
Yes, it's so interesting because just I'm teaching an apocalypse course now. We read Solovyov's short history of the Antichrist. And of course, in his view, the first few things that the son of the Antichrist does is establish peace on earth so that there's no more fighting, then establishes material comfort or material satiety. And then once they have peace and material satiety, they need entertainment, right? He quotes Juvenal, I think, about bread and circuses being the responsibility of the state. But then once they're entertained, that's when the religious problem begins. That's what he calls it, the religious. What do we do about this religious sentiment, right? So there are so many parallels to the kind of questions that they were asking at the end of the 19th. Beginning of the 20th century, and I have more, but it is interesting, that connection. From Paul Hunchak, what do you think the effects of Patriarch Kirill's experience in the West through his WCC involvement and his many years in the Department of External Relations? Right.
It's a very good question. It's a very interesting question because I think it's quite a controversy that we can see in the personality of Kirill, because at the time when he was in Geneva and also when he was heading the Moscow Patriarchate's Department for External Relations, he has been quite liberal, and he has been also involved in ecumenical dialogue and has been actually perceived by many Orthodox traditionalists and fundamentalists as someone advocating for more liberal values also within the church. And he had quite a few problems also with this reputation when he became the head of the Russian Orthodox Church. But then he changed considerably. He changed his positions, and you can really see this. You can see this in his addresses, and this has to deal with the Russian Orthodox Church itself, and with these factions, with this ideological cleavages within the church. And the fundamentalist group is quite important. And in the recent years, you could clearly observe a certain shift of the official Russian Orthodox Church towards more nationalist, more fundamentalist groups. So they're trying to embrace these groups within the church and then sometimes even emanate this. So you can observe also this transition and this change that Kirill has experienced in order to be able to address the flock and to address also more radical forces within the church itself. But there is definitely a contradiction, I think, and also with regards to his positions towards policy and the Russian state. There was also a different set of statements. So for instance, in 2011, when the political protest movement was formed in Moscow, he was quite, he was addressing this, and he was saying, well, the state has to do something with this. It has a reason that people actually join protests and have their demands. So that is what he said in his interview, his Christmas interview. But then all of a sudden, a month later, he's completely changing his position. He's criticizing the protest movement and he's praising Putin. So you see there are some external influences on his position. So
yes,
yeah.
I wanted to sort of carefully define when we talk about Patriarch Kirill's formerly liberal views, just because it means probably something very different than what we're used to in academic circles, being liberal, right? What would that mean in this context, that he was, like, what kinds of things would have made him liberal and then switch to being conservative? What qualifies as liberal is another way of asking.
So, yeah, it's a good question. It's a philosophical question. Of course, it's the relationship and to the state. So it's usually Orthodox liberals embrace democracy. They embrace and support individual rights. They're quite strong advocates also of the separation between the church and the state. And ecumenism also is quite an important issue. So having dialogue also with other confessions, which is a no-go for Orthodox fundamentalists, for instance. So for them, they have a vision of an Orthodox monarchy, a God-given state. So in their eyes, even today's Russian state that is embracing Orthodoxy and that is using a lot of this discourse, religiously inspired discourse, it's actually not acceptable. It doesn't go far enough. It's not a monarchy. It's not a God-given monarchy that they want to have.
Great. I hope I'm not mispronouncing this name. Father Tony Vrama he asks, is the strategy, I assume Kirill's media strategy, insofar as it exists, global, and is it multilingual?
It's a good question, because I was focusing, of course, on the Russian language discourse. And when I was analyzing this media strategy, I would read a lot of his addresses, his reports at the conciliar meetings, because he would continuously address the media sphere and give his recommendations. It is global in a way that he understands the transformation of religion. He understands the impact of the media sphere on religion and is engaging in this dialogue. But in Russia itself, I would say that the focus was on the Russian language sources. So a number of Orthodox TV channels was established, Soyuz, Tsargrad, Spas, various Orthodox websites. And Kirill, I think that the website of the Moscow Patriarchate was one of the first ones established within the church, so quite early, also connected to the personality of Kirill. That the social media networks, there is a Russian language social network even for the Orthodox community, Yelitsa, that RU, and various networks, various channels also on existing social networks. So the focus on the Russian language is much more important, but I can imagine that there is also an attempt to address more global audiences and English language sources.
Great, and we have so many questions. I'm doing my best to filter them according to how I understand.
I'd like to see the audience. It's such a pity that I can't see people who attend the seminar.
It is something that would be nice. They're here, however. And Ekaterina Grishaeva says, Hannah, how did the recent censorship of the internet in Russia affect online critique of the Russian Orthodox Church?
Yes, it's a very good question. Thank you, Ekaterina. It's a dear friend of mine with whom I spent a lot of time and who has also kindly informed this book. She's a wonderful scholar. She's focusing on media and religion in Russia today. And indeed, censorship has a huge impact on discourse in Russia. And even this book, I could see year after year how websites, how different portals have been blocked, how videos all of a sudden disappeared. So some of the videos I analyzed in the book, some of the websites and pages on social networks, they're not accessible anymore. So the censorship is quite extensive in the Russian context, and it is supported by the state, but also by the church. So you see, and that is what I'm also describing in the chapter on the media strategy, is that there is an abundance of information about the church. So a lot of websites, a lot of channels. So the church is really there, is engaging, has provided a lot of resources. There are staff positions, etc. But actually didn't change the level of discussion about the church and religious issues. which is Sergei Chepnin, the former editor of the Moscow Patriarchate Journal. He describes this as the new silence, which is very interesting. So you have this, the church is addressing the media sphere, sees the importance of modern media, social networks, of secular media, but at the same time faces a lot of challenges in addressing these modern audiences. And you can see that also from the number of commenters, of speakers who speak on behalf of the church, who are allowed in a way to represent the official position of the church, it has become quite limited. So even in the 2010s, you had a lot of intellectuals, you had a lot of laity also coming in and providing comments on religious affairs and religious news. But today it's very different. So the number of official commenters on the Russian Orthodox Church is, it's basically in most cases Patriarch Kirill himself, because he has the authority to speak and he has the authority to address Russian audiences. So it's indeed a very, very important topic.
Well, thank you for the question and answer for that matter. Patrick Mickelson says, thank you, Hannah, for sharing your research with us. I have 2.5 questions. Let's see how many we can cover. First, has the pandemic driven the Russian Church to adopt a larger online presence than before, as it partly has, for example, among churches in the United States? Maybe I'll just give you one at a time, if that's
okay. I'm excited about the remaining question, this 0.5 question, what this will be about. Yeah, the pandemic, that's quite interesting. The impact has been quite devastating on the Russian Church because, of course, in terms of the revenues, in terms of the church finances, it's very much focusing on communion, it's very much focusing on religious rites, and it's focusing on Eucharist, and for that you need to be in the church. And as far as what I know, what I have read so far, there has been quite some resistance against adopting towards digital practices. So resistance towards just emanating the Eucharist and kind of re-importing it into the digital context. So there is a controversial debate about this, but the fundamentalist camp's views of that are quite clear. So it remains to be seen.
Well, the second and a half are very interesting questions too. So
Definitely.
do you know of any examples of icon veneration occurring online? I'm particularly interested in this. I teach a course on the icon. Do you know of any examples of icons being turned into non-fungible tokens?
It's a good one.
It's great. They're both super interesting questions. Yeah.
That's an interesting question. And there is some research done by Mikhail Suslov. He's writing about, in particular, adaptation of digital practices towards religious rites. And I think that he has found indeed a couple of icons and digital churches or churches that exist as digital objects. So there must be something. I don't have an answer right now. But of course, I would suspect that most of Orthodox believers would naturally venerate icons online. But maybe.
What would you bless? Would you bless the program that puts it up? Would you bless the computer? That's a very interesting question. And
with the metaverse and the possibilities that are opening up.
There we go. Yeah. Yes.
There is something for that in the future.
Let's see. Jose Casanova and a couple of others have mentioned this. How is the conflict with the Ecumenical Patriarch and the loss of hegemony over Ukrainian Orthodoxy affecting the Ruski Mir project and the project of hegemony over global Orthodoxy?
First of all, thank you for being here to all of the listeners, but Jose Casanova in particular. I was so happy and lucky to meet you in person many years ago in Uppsala, I think it was. And thank you for this question, because it's really it's very key. I did not address it in the book because I think that this would become a completely different book if I had to touch upon the discourse also in Ukraine. But it's a very important instance of of the relationship between the church and the state, and that the interests of the church and the state in Russia are not the same. And Ukraine is really the best example for that, because it was really not in the interest of the Russian Orthodox Church to go into this conflict. The annexation of Crimea was not in the interest of the Russian Orthodox Church. As we know, it has 1/3 of its parishes in Ukraine. Ukraine is a much more religious society in comparison to the Russian society. It has a much bigger religious pluralism. So the church was quite absent in the discussions and was not providing a commentary on what at the beginning when the annexation of Crimea happened. So they would be just passive observers, basically. And of course, the ideological concept of Ruski Mir perceives the influence of the Russian Orthodox Church that goes beyond the territory of the Russian Federation. And now it has become a very politicized issue, which is dividing the believers. It is dividing believers also in Ukraine. So this is an issue that will stay there for years, if not for decades.
Good. Lena Molokotos Leiderman mentions first, thank you for such an engaging presentation. That's a thanks to you, Hannah. Apologies if this question may be too general or slightly off topic. Could you say something about the relations and the connections between the Russian Orthodox Church and other Orthodox churches, Greek, Romanian, etc.? It's related to this last question. In the context of the mediatization of orthodoxy that you have just described, is this something that you explored in your research and book?
It's actually the question that I'm not exploring. So I'm not a theologian or a religious scholar in that sense. So I've not been investigating the relationship towards other local churches, Orthodox churches. So I apologize that I cannot address this in more detail for you.
No, it's good to have a sense for the scope of the work. But
there are of course conflicts, and the fact that the Russian Orthodox Church did not participate in the Crete Council and has been blocking some of the decisions. So you see a lot of politicization in that field.
So Aaron Davis asks, do you think the transition of Kirill's sentiments towards the liberal political movement has any alignment with the silencing of Russian bishops during the militant atheist era, such as Sergius Stragorodsky, sorry.
Mm-hmm. Could you repeat the question again? Silencing of the bishops.
Do you think the transition of Kirill's sentiments toward the liberal political movement has any alignment with the silencing of Russian bishops during the militant atheist era, such as Sergius Stragorodsky?
Mm-hmm. I'm not sure that we observe this transitioning towards more liberalism. I think that what we see in Russia today is that Kirill is becoming much more conservative, much more traditionalist commenter on the issues.
That connects to this next question from Elizabeth Theokratov. Mentioning that we refer to fundamentalists in the Russian church, and what do we actually mean? I suppose the other end of defining liberalism means in some sense, giving some sense for fundamentalism.
Exactly. So the important difference between the liberals and the fundamentalists is how they assess the state, the democracy. So we have already discussed that for fundamentalists. The concept of monarchy is very important, and that already clashes with the basis of the social doctrine, of the social concept of the Russian Orthodox Church, where the Moscow Patriarchate, the official church, is recognizing that it lives in a secular state and in a modern state, but it is eager to engage with the state, so it does not propose a God-given monarchy as a model, but it's not what is accepted by the fundamentalists. So that is a very important question. They see really a Russian monarch as the only possible ruler of the Russian nation. And then, of course, also with regards to ecumenism, to the relationship with other churches, globalization, urbanization, all of these aspects are being denied, are not being accepted. And then also there are voices that advocate for the canonization of such controversial figures as Rasputin, for instance, or Tsar, even the Great. So there are also these tendencies within this camp.
So yeah, it seems like it's primarily an attitude towards church-state relations that we're speaking about, right? On the one hand, we have liberalism in the sense of pluralism, separation, clear distinction, a separation of church and state. And on the other hand, we have a kind of motioning towards maybe theocracy or monarchy. Good.
Exactly.
Well, I wanted to kind of bring, let's see, we have one more question here, we may as well. Pablo Smitsnyuk, is the Russian Orthodox Church's narrative on ecumenical matters any different in Russia and for the foreign public? I would be especially interested in the dialogue with the Catholics after the Havana meeting.
It's also quite a controversial issue, and I'm sure that there are scholars who can provide a much more detailed picture of that and also of the divisions within the church. But from what I know and from what I've read around the time, even the meeting with Pope Francis was quite questioned and quite challenged. So apparently it was not even publicly discussed within the church. So it was just a position, a decision that was made by Patriarch Kirill himself. So already here you see that there are a lot of cleavages and there are a lot of conflicts towards how to position the church towards the Roman Catholic Church. And then, of course, in Russia itself, the stance is quite clear. And Patriarch Kirill has been behind the legislation that was proposed in 1997, the so-called religious law. And this religious law has introduced the notion of so-called traditional religions. So at the time, as you know, in the 90s, Russia has had extreme religious pluralism, and any confessions could be active in Russia. But then since 1997, the Russian legislation has introduced the so-called four traditional religions. So it has defined the religions that had the legitimacy to operate on the Russian territory: Russian Orthodoxy, Islam, Buddhism, and Judaism, which, as you understand, are mostly attached to a particular territory, like the North Caucasus and Tatarstan for Islam, and that is why the Russian Orthodox Church has received, in a way, a privileged position. And this is important, in particular, for the Moscow Patriarchate, because they could deal in this way with the support from the state with other Christian confessions on the Russian territory, in particular the Roman Catholic Church, and in particular also the Protestant denominations in Russia. And if you look at the events of the last couple of years, if you go to the website of Sava Analytical Center, then you will be quite shocked actually by how many cases have been initiated in Russian legal cases, legal proceedings against different religious minorities, Protestant churches. So it's really dominating the scene at the moment.
You've been so accommodating to our rapid fire questioning. I want to give you a moment to breathe. In a way of sort of turning towards closing the conversation for now, it's interesting. I was thinking a lot about actually Father Sergius Bulgakov and his political ideology before, well, right at the turn of the 19th and early 20th century. Mm-hmm. And it's such, a colleague of mine recently pointed out, Yuri Korgan, that it's just such an unbelievably wild ideological time, that there was a grand sort of search for where to go from this wide open place. And for Bulgakov, and Rowan Williams writes brilliantly about this. He was sort of Bulgakov was interested in turning towards the past again to have an image that is known, that is familiar, that's somehow still in the culture, so that they knew what to follow, right? Because they were essentially imageless in that moment. And it seems like something similar might have happened here with the collapse of the Soviet Union, where there was a strong sense of what the history was. And in some sense, the church went underground and didn't disappear by any means. But now there's this search for kind of a guiding moral identity, but also a cultural identity. And they're stuck in a similar kind of position where they're turning to the thing that has been known historically, but by doing that, they're also reinventing it as they understand it in the process. So it's a really kind of interesting, on the one hand, repetition of history. On the other hand, there are obvious differences. Any response to that kind of closing thought?
I think that you have to expand this thought and to give it more elaboration, because it's quite interesting indeed. And the Russian search for identity was really central after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, because you could see that all of a sudden there was this deep social, political, economic crisis. There was the breakdown of social institutions, of values, of everything people believed in. And the church was the only institution that was untouched by the communist regime. And that is why the discourse of the humiliated church, the church that was persecuted, that was marginalized, that was oppressed in Soviet times, has become so visible and so important in Russian society, and why the church until today still has very high levels of trust because of not being touched by this times in these ways, despite the collaboration which was necessary at the time, of course, but still this image of a humiliated church is quite important, and people streamed into the church with the hope of finding questions and finding answers to the questions about the national identity indeed, and that is what the Russian church was providing. But at the same time, it's a different society indeed. It's a modern society, it's an urbanized society, it's a well-educated society. So it's not the 19th century church. It's not a state church that is dependent on the state to provide education, to provide everything that was needed. So it is operating in a secular environment. And I think that this is quite an interesting, fascinating contradiction between claiming that the Russian Orthodox Church is this traditional institution that is supporting family values, etc., and has this historical links with the church, but at the same time being quite a modernized institution. And if you look at the reforms that Patriarch Kirill has introduced, you will be astonished by some of the institutes that never existed in the past or have existed in the past, but not really in the form that the church has them today.
I'm not sure we could end on a better note, or more articulate note. Would you like to add anything else in the way of closing thoughts? You've given us so much that I won't pull anything out of you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for all the wonderful questions, for attending the session. I hope you will get in touch with me. I'd be happy to have conversations afterwards. I hope you will find the book also of use. I did have analyzed a lot of Russian language sources because I struggled myself because I couldn't find this information. I couldn't find articles and analysis made for me, so I had to go into the original sources. So that is what the book also provides, and I hope that this will be of help to you, but also to students, hoping that there will be more interest in the Russian Church and what is happening in Russia today, but also historically, and that there will be even more research because it's desperately needed. There are a lot of questions that are still open.
Wonderful. And it's an incredible map of the media landscape in Russia, by the way, and exquisitely well researched. So thank you so much for that. I have a very short couple of announcements before we close. I'm grateful for our attendees, especially the ones who participated and contributed so much to our discussions today. Grateful to the co-directors of the Orthodox Christian Studies Center for providing the platform. That's George Demokopoulos and Aristotle Papanikolaou, and the associate director, Nathaniel Wood, who, by the way, is also the managing editor of the Studies Center's publication of scholarly research called Public Orthodoxy. You can look it up at publicorthodoxy.org. And special thanks to collaborators from Fordham, Fordham's executive assistant Siobhan Verleza, and Catherine Mandalakis for helping to organize and promote the event. We are also going to have our next installment of the Russia question on March 8th with Klemena Antonova, and she's going to discuss visual thought in Russian religious philosophy, along with her article in the Oxford Handbook on Russian Religious Thought that we discussed in a previous Russian webinar, which I encourage you to look up because it was with fascinating scholars. After that, on April Fools, as it turns out, we'll be meeting with Paul Valliere and Randall Poole to discuss their work on law and Christianity in the Russian tradition. Welcome to everyone who is visiting for the first time, and thank you to all who have come and been here before. Thank you so much, Hannah. You've taught us so much and clearly established yourself as an amazing resource on these topics. And thank you for having this discussion about your work here.
Thank you, Michael, also for being such an attentive reader. It's just been the best compliment I could really get.
You're welcome.
Thank you.